the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Let's go now to Andrea.
I just had a question about parents that are really sad and discouraged that their kids aren't getting married in the church. And I've noticed that your response is always the same, like, it's so selfish. Why can't they just do this simple thing for their parents?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I've always kind of asked myself is, would we really want people to get married in the church if they don't believe in what a Catholic marriage means? My husband and I did like 6 months to a year of marriage prep, and I thought I knew everything about him. And after doing that marriage prep, I'm like, whoa, I really didn't. And we learned so much about our faith and marriage and what it means to have a Catholic marriage. Obviously things like divorce is just, that's not an option for us. And so when I hear you say, like, it's not that big of a deal, you guys can just do this for your parents, I think for some people it would be a really big deal.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree per se, but what I mean by that is if they don't really care one way or the other, so let's talk about a young person like that, just doesn't really care. It's not that big of a deal to say, we'll get married in the church, and then we'll go have our lavish wedding reception at the beach or the park or something like that. From where I stand, it doesn't seem to me to be that big of a deal. In my view, it's not that big of a deal because of all the benefits that it would bring to your family, to your parents. Now, let me explain the reason why this is even an issue at all. It didn't used to be, but the church in her canon law made a provision. The church said that in order for validity, that this was required, that the couple get married in the church and have it witnessed officially by a bishop, priest, or deacon. And one of the reasons for this change in the church's law was because there were women who were being, quote unquote, married by, maybe a young man who might be going off to war or something else. And the church permitted clandestine weddings, but very often what would happen is the woman would be jilted. And the man would say, well, I didn't marry her. And the reason is because there was no priest present. There was no official formal witness of this. It didn't take place publicly in a church. And so one of the practical reasons that the church made this change was to protect women from being jilted. And the guy would just run off and he would claim that they were never really married, even though they were. So that's one example of where there were abuses, mainly toward women. And so the church changed the law, making this a necessary requirement for the validity of the marriage. But I've read some canon law literature, Andrea, that says, and I tend to agree with this, it makes sense to me, that there are some canon lawyers who would very much like to see the church strike this from the law so that it was no longer required for validity. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but it could happen, is my point. This is the current circumstance, and we're obliged to follow the church's law. But it's something that I can see a benefit if the church were to change that. But back to your question, why should they get married in the church if they're not practicing their faith anyway? The reason is because they're still Catholic. Once you're a Catholic, you're always a Catholic. If they've received the sacraments, baptism, confirmation, Holy Eucharist, they're fully initiated. And even though they may fall away from a practice of the faith, they still have the obligations required. They may not recognize that, but they still do. So in a way, if I can use a mundane analogy, Andrea, let's say you're an American citizen, but you decide you want to move to, let's say, France. And you set up a business in France and you're making a lot of money. Well, the IRS is going to say, that's great, hope you're enjoying it, but you owe taxes here in the United States. And you'd say, well, I don't live in the United States. And they'd say, tough luck. As a citizen of the United States, one of your obligations is to pay taxes. And according to the law of the United States, it doesn't matter where you live. If you're making money in Paris, France, let's say, you have to pay taxes to the U.S. government. And it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it might be helpful to see that even though somebody might walk away from their faith, they still have the obligations before God. And that's what the church is saying. What do you think about those thoughts?
What you're saying makes sense. And honestly, I would love to see everybody get married in the church. It makes me sad, when I hear these parents call in. And then I just, to me, it seems like the bigger issue is you have a kid who is away from the faith, they're not willing to get married in the church. Like, you have bigger problems, it seems, And it seems like the focus on the church wedding seems like the wrong focus. I don't know.
Well, here's where I don't agree on that point, and that's because the church is right to call people back to a practice of their faith. So what did Jesus say? He's the good shepherd. He goes in search of the lost sheep. He leaves the other 99, and he goes in search of the lost sheep to bring that sheep home. That's the rightful outcome for anybody who leaves the church, is that he should come home. And so the church, by saying you need to get married in the church, it's one way of trying to draw that straying sheep home again. Doesn't mean it will necessarily cause them to start their faith again, but it's an invitation to come back. And so I think the church is wise to do this, especially in a time when there's just so much apathy among many Catholics. They just don't really care. They don't realize that they've been given this tremendous gift, and it doesn't affect them, it doesn't bother them. It is a conundrum, though, I admit. It is a difficult thing, and I too wish that people would take these things seriously, but in the meantime, we do the best we can, right, Andrea?
Yep.
Well, thank you. Important question you asked, and I'm glad you did.